There are medical records that were never meant to be read. In the humid parishes of Louisiana, sometime around 1849, a set of hospital journals disappeared from a clinic along the banks of the Mississippi River. Those who saw what was written inside spoke in whispers about a child whose symptoms defied every principle of medicine known at the time. 7 physicians examined the boy over the course of 11 months. Not one would sign the death certificate. What they witnessed in that fever-stricken room challenged their understanding of the human body so profoundly that 3 of them abandoned medicine entirely within a year. The case was documented in meticulous detail, then systematically buried. Files were lost. Witnesses refused to speak. Families moved away and changed their names. Tonight, we piece together what those doctors saw, and why the truth about the Carter child was buried deeper than his grave. Before we continue with the story of the Carter family, if you're fascinated by the dark mysteries hidden in America's past, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. Stories like these need to be told, and we're glad you're here to uncover them with us. Now, let's step back to where it all began, in a Louisiana community where cotton, fever, and silence ruled in equal measure. The year was 1849, and the town of Bellefontaine sat nestled along a bend in the Mississippi River, about 40 miles south of Baton Rouge. It wasn't a large town, perhaps 300 souls at most, but it thrived on the commerce that flowed through the port. Cotton bales moved through daily, stacked high on flatboats and steamers heading toward New Orleans. The air was perpetually thick, humid enough to curl paper left on a desk overnight, and the smell of river mud mingled with magnolia and wood smoke. Bellefontaine was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where debts and gossip were currency as real as silver, and where the fever season brought a kind of resigned dread every summer. The town consisted of a main street with perhaps 20 buildings, a general store, a tavern, a church, the cotton trading office, a blacksmith, and Dr. Nathaniel Grisham's medical practice. Behind these establishments, wooden houses spread out in irregular rows, some painted, most not, all raised on brick pillars to protect against the floods that came with disturbing regularity. The people of Bellefontaine lived by the rhythms of the river and the seasons. Spring meant planting, summer meant sweltering heat and disease, autumn brought harvest and profit, winter offered a brief respite before the cycle began again. Most families had lived in the area for generations, their fortunes tied to the land and the cotton trade. There were the wealthy plantation owners who lived upriver but conducted business in town, the merchants and clerks who facilitated commerce, the laborers who loaded and unloaded cargo at the docks, and the enslaved people who worked the fields and performed countless tasks that kept the economy functioning. In 1849, the nation was fracturing. Debates about slavery, about statehood, about the Mexican-American War that had just ended, created tensions even in small communities. People were careful about what they said and to whom they said it. Trust was a scarce commodity. The Baptist church on the north end of town preached one vision of morality, while the Catholic chapel on the south end offered another. Some families supported the expansion of slavery into new territories, seeing it as economic necessity. Others, a quieter minority, harbored doubts they would never voice publicly. Into this world of heat, commerce, and unspoken divisions, the Carter family lived what seemed like an ordinary life. Thomas Carter was 34 years old in the spring of 1849. He had worked as a clerk in the Bellefontaine Cotton Exchange for 7 years, a position that required precision, discretion, and patience. He managed ledgers, recorded transactions, calculated weights and prices, and handled correspondence with buyers in New Orleans and beyond. It was steady work that paid modestly but reliably. Thomas was a quiet man, thin and serious, with dark hair beginning to recede and a habit of chewing on the end of his pen when concentrating. His wife, Margaret, was 31. She had been born in Bellefontaine, the daughter of a ferryman who had drowned when she was 12. She learned to sew from her mother and discovered she had a talent for it. By the time she married Thomas at 19, she was taking in work from the wealthier families in the parish. mending clothes, altering dresses, occasionally creating pieces from scratch. She worked from a small room in their house, where she kept her fabrics, threads, and precious sewing machine, one of the few in Bellefontaine. They had 3 children. The eldest, Charlotte, was 12 years old, a serious girl with her father's dark hair and careful nature. She helped her mother with sewing and looked after her younger siblings. The middle child, Anne, was 9, more spirited and curious, always asking questions, always wandering off to explore the riverbank or the woods at the edge of town. And then there was Daniel, 6 years old, the quiet one. Daniel was not a sickly child, but he had always been pale, delicate in a way his sisters were not. He tired easily and preferred indoor activities to rough play with other boys. He liked to watch his mother sew, following the movement of the needle with intense concentration. He collected smooth stones from the riverbank and arranged them in patterns on the porch. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and even then his answers were brief, thoughtful, as if he were considering every word carefully before releasing it. Margaret worried about him in the way mothers do, but Thomas insisted the boy would grow stronger with time. "He's just thoughtful," Thomas would say. Nothing wrong with a thoughtful child. The Carter home was a modest wooden structure on the eastern edge of town, close enough to the levee that they could hear the steam whistles of passing boats. It had 4 rooms, a main room where they cooked and ate, 2 small bedrooms, and Margaret's sewing room. The furniture was simple but well maintained. Margaret's needlework decorated the walls, samplers with Bible verses and floral patterns. A small garden behind the house provided vegetables in season. They kept chickens in a coop and bought milk from a neighbor who owned a cow. It was a life without luxury, but not without comfort. They were neither wealthy nor destitute, neither prominent nor invisible. They attended church on Sundays, paid their debts on time, kept to themselves. Exactly the kind of family that history usually forgets. But history would not forget the Carters. Dr. Nathaniel Grisham ran the only medical practice in Bellefontaine, a clapboard building with a single examination room, a cramped office where he kept his journals and instruments, and a small storage room for medicines and supplies. He was 47 years old in 1849, a graduate of the Medical College of Louisiana in New Orleans, and he had been practicing in Bellefontaine for 15 years. Grisham was a methodical man, careful in his observations, conservative in his treatments. He had seen enough of medicine to know its limitations. In 1849, medical science was as much art as discipline. Doctors still believed in the 4 humors, still practiced bloodletting, still relied on mercury and laudanum for conditions they didn't understand. Germ theory was years away from acceptance. Anesthesia was just beginning to be used. Surgery was a last resort, performed quickly and with high mortality rates. Grisham's patients trusted him not because he could cure every ailment, but because he was honest about what he didn't know. He would tell a family when their loved one was beyond help. He would admit when a treatment was experimental. He kept detailed records of every case, noting symptoms, treatments, and outcomes, believing that careful documentation was the path to better understanding. His practice was housed in a building he rented from a merchant named Dupree. The examination room contained a wooden table covered with a thin mattress, a cabinet for instruments, a wash basin, and shelves lined with bottles and jars. His instruments were basic: scalpels, forceps, a stethoscope, a fever thermometer, a set of cupping glasses for bloodletting, various saws and probes for more serious procedures. He had a small collection of medical texts, most of them decades old. A copy of Benjamin Rush's Medical Inquiries, a treatise on fevers, several volumes of case studies from European physicians. Grisham had treated everything Bellefontaine had to offer: fevers, breaks and sprains, difficult births, consumption, cholera, snake bites, knife wounds from tavern fights, burns, infections. He had lost patients, many patients, but he had also saved lives that would have been lost without intervention. He understood the rhythm of illness in the town, knew which seasons brought which diseases, could predict with reasonable accuracy what each week would bring. He was a bachelor, living in 2 rooms above his practice. His life was his work. He had no family in Bellefontaine, no close friends, though he was respected by everyone who knew him. He attended church irregularly, more out of social obligation than religious conviction. He read medical journals when he could obtain them, ordered supplies from New Orleans twice a year, and wrote occasional letters to former colleagues seeking advice on difficult cases. In all his years of practice, Dr. Nathaniel Grisham had never encountered a case like Daniel Carter. Nothing in his training, his reading, or his experience had prepared him for what was about to unfold. The morning of June 14, 1849, began like any other. The sun rose into a cloudless sky, promising another day of oppressive heat. Margaret Carter woke early, as she always did, and went to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. Thomas had already left for the cotton exchange, where he needed to complete an inventory before the day's trading began. Charlotte and Anne were still asleep in their shared bed. Margaret was stirring a pot of grits when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned and found Daniel standing in the doorway. He was in his nightshirt, barefoot, his pale hair uncombed. But something about him was wrong. He was standing perfectly still, his arms hanging at his sides, his eyes open but unfocused. "Daniel," Margaret said. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" He didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't move at all. Margaret set down the spoon and walked toward him, her heart beginning to beat faster. "Daniel, can you hear me?" Still nothing. She knelt in front of him, putting her hands on his shoulders. His skin was hot, burning hot, as if he'd been standing in front of a fire. She gasped and pulled her hands back, then touched his forehead. He was burning with fever, the heat radiating from him in waves. "Thomas," she called, forgetting that her husband had already left. "Charlotte, come here quickly." Charlotte appeared from the bedroom, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She saw her brother standing motionless in the doorway and froze. "What's wrong with him?" "Go fetch your father," Margaret said, trying to keep the panic from her voice. "Run to the cotton exchange. Tell him Daniel is sick. Hurry." Charlotte ran, her bare feet slapping on the wooden porch. Margaret lifted Daniel, surprised at how rigid his body was, and carried him to his bed. She laid him down carefully, but he remained in the same position, arms at his sides, eyes open and staring at the ceiling. She fetched a cloth and a basin of water, wringing out the cloth and laying it across his forehead. The cloth was warm within seconds. Thomas arrived within 15 minutes, followed by Charlotte. He took one look at Daniel and immediately said, "I'll get Dr. Grisham." Grisham arrived before noon. He carried his black leather bag and moved with the calm efficiency of long practice. He examined Daniel thoroughly, checking his pulse, listening to his heartbeat, looking into his eyes and mouth, testing his reflexes by tapping his knees and elbows with a small mallet. The pulse was rapid, but not dangerously so. The heartbeat seemed normal. The temperature was high, perhaps 104 degrees by Grisham's estimation. But what concerned him most was the complete lack of response. The boy was clearly awake, his eyes were open and his pupils reacted to light, but he showed no awareness of his surroundings, no reaction to touch or sound. "How long has he been like this?" Grisham asked. "I found him this morning standing in the kitchen doorway," Margaret said. "He hasn't moved since. He hasn't spoken, hasn't responded to anything I've said. Has he had a fever before this?" "Not recently. He's always been pale, always tired easily, but he hasn't been sick." Grisham examined Daniel's limbs more carefully, noting the rigidity in the muscles. It wasn't the rigidity of rigor mortis, the boy was clearly alive, but rather a kind of tense immobility, as if his body were locked in position. "I've seen high fevers cause confusion and delirium," Grisham said slowly, "but I've never seen one cause complete unresponsiveness like this. The boy seems awake but unable or unwilling to move." "What does that mean?" Thomas asked. "What's causing it?" "I don't know yet," Grisham admitted. "It could be a fever brought on by infection, though I see no obvious source. It could be related to the nervous system. I'll need to monitor him closely." He prepared a tincture of willow bark to reduce the fever, and instructed Margaret to keep Daniel cool with damp cloths. to try to get him to drink water if possible, and to send for him immediately if there was any change. He would return the next day, but by the next morning, Daniel's condition had worsened in ways that defied every pattern Grisham knew. Doctor. Grisham arrived at the Carter house shortly after dawn on June 15th. Margaret met him at the door, her face pale and drawn. She had not slept. "He hasn't moved," she said. "Not once. Not a finger, not his eyes, nothing. And doctor, there's something else." She led him to Daniel's room. The boy was lying exactly as Grisham had left him the previous day, on his back, arms at his sides, eyes open. But when Grisham examined him, he understood Margaret's fear. Daniel's body had become completely rigid. Every muscle was tense, locked in place. Grisham tried to bend the boy's arm, and found it nearly impossible, as if the joints had been fused. The skin was still hot with fever, but now there was something else, a peculiar dryness, the skin feeling almost waxy to the touch. More disturbing was the boy's eyes. They were open, staring straight up at the ceiling, but they did not move. They did not track Grisham as he moved around the bed. They did not blink when he passed his hand in front of them. Yet the pupils still reacted to light when Grisham held a candle close. "Dear God," Grisham whispered, more to himself than to Margaret. He performed every test he could think of. He pricked Daniel's skin with a pin in several places, no reaction. He clapped his hands loudly near the boy's ear, no reaction. He lifted one of Daniel's eyelids closed and released it. The eye remained closed for a moment, then slowly, very slowly, opened again. Grisham took out his stethoscope, a relatively new instrument he had acquired only 2 years ago, and listened to Daniel's heart. What he heard made him check again, certain he must be mistaken. The heartbeat was there, steady and regular, but slow. Extraordinarily slow, perhaps 40 beats per minute, less than half the normal rate for a child. "Is he dying?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. Grisham didn't answer immediately. He was trained never to give false hope, but he also didn't want to pronounce a death sentence without cause. "His heart is beating," he said finally. "He's breathing. By all measures, he's alive, but this condition, I've never seen anything like it." Over the course of that day, Grisham tried every treatment in his arsenal. He administered purgatives, hoping to clear any infection from the bowels. Nothing happened. Daniel's body did not respond at all. He applied heated cupping glasses to the boy's back, drawing blood to the surface in the traditional way. The skin rose and reddened, but Daniel showed no sign of discomfort. He tried cold compresses, hot compresses, poultices made from mustard and herbs. Nothing produced any change. By evening, Grisham was forced to admit defeat, at least temporarily. He left detailed instructions for Margaret. Continue the cool cloths. Try to get liquid into the boy's mouth, drop by drop. Watch for any change at all, no matter how small. He would return in the morning and every morning after that, until he understood what was happening. As Grisham walked back to his practice through the humid evening air, he felt a creeping sense of dread he had never experienced before. In 15 years of medicine, he had seen patients die. He had seen suffering he could not alleviate. But he had always understood, at least in general terms, what was happening. A fever from infection, a wound that turned septic, a consumption that slowly destroyed the lungs. This was different. Daniel Carter was alive but absent, present but unreachable. It was as if the boy had been removed from his own body, leaving only an empty shell that continued to breathe and maintain a heartbeat for reasons Grisham could not comprehend. That night, Grisham wrote the first of what would become dozens of journal entries about the case. His handwriting, usually neat and controlled, was shakier than normal. June 15, 1849. Patient. Daniel Carter, male, age 6. Presented with severe rigidity of all voluntary muscles, complete unresponsiveness to external stimuli, and a fever of unknown origin. Pulse approximately 40 beats per minute. Pupils reactive to light, but eyes do not track movement. No response to pain, sound, or touch. Cannot speak, cannot move voluntarily, yet appears to be awake. I am at a complete loss to explain these symptoms. They fit no disease pattern I have studied or encountered. Have administered willow bark, performed cupping, applied various external treatments. No change observed. Patient's mother reports he has been in this state for approximately 30 hours. Prognosis unknown. By the third day, word of Daniel Carter's condition had spread throughout Bellefontaine. In a town of 300 people, news traveled faster than fever, and Daniel's illness was unlike anything anyone had seen before. People began to whisper in the general store, at the church, along the docks. Theories multiplied with each retelling. Some said it was river sickness, some new illness brought by the boats that came from New Orleans. Others claimed it was punishment from God, though for what sin no one could quite agree. A few suggested it might be something the boy had eaten, a poisonous plant or spoiled food. The more superstitious spoke in hushed tones about curses and dark magic, though these whispers were quickly silenced by those who considered themselves more civilized. The pastor of the Baptist Church, Reverend William Holloway, visited the Carter home on June 17th. He was a large man, gray-haired and booming-voiced, who normally filled his church with passionate sermons about salvation and damnation. But when he saw Daniel lying motionless in bed, his eyes open and empty, Holloway fell silent. He prayed over the boy, his deep voice filling the small room, but there was a tremor in it that betrayed his fear. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said to Margaret and Thomas when the prayer was finished. "We cannot always understand his purpose, but we must have faith that there is a reason for this trial." Margaret nodded, but her eyes were hollow. She had been sitting by Daniel's bedside almost constantly for 3 days, leaving only when absolutely necessary. She had barely eaten, had not slept for more than a few minutes at a time. Her hands trembled as she dabbed Daniel's forehead with a damp cloth, a gesture that had become automatic, almost ritualistic, though it seemed to have no effect on the boy's fever. Thomas stood by the window, staring out at the street. He had gone to work for a few hours each day, needing the normalcy, needing something to do besides watch his son lie there like a living corpse. But his mind was elsewhere, and his supervisor at the cotton exchange had already commented on errors in his ledgers. Charlotte and Anne had been sent to stay with Margaret's sister, who lived 3 miles outside of town. The decision had been difficult, but Margaret insisted. She didn't want the girls to see their brother like this, didn't want them exposed to whatever illness had taken hold of him. The house felt emptier without them, quieter, as if the silence of Daniel's condition had spread to fill every room. Dr. Grisham visited twice daily now, morning and evening, documenting every detail of Daniel's condition. He measured the boy's temperature, pulse, and respiration at each visit. He examined the rigidity of the limbs, tested reflexes, observed the eyes. He tried different medications: quinine for fever, mercury for what he thought might be a nervous disorder, even opium in the hope it might produce some response. Nothing worked. Nothing changed. By June 20th, 6 days into the illness, Grisham made a decision. He needed help. This case was beyond his experience, beyond his knowledge. He sat down that evening and wrote letters to 3 physicians he had known in New Orleans, describing the case in as much detail as he could and begging for advice. He sent the letters on the next steamer heading downriver, knowing it would be at least several days before he could hope for a response. What he didn't know was that one of those physicians, Dr. Claude Fontaine, would read the letter and immediately board a steamer back to Bellefontaine. Because Dr. Fontaine had seen this before, Dr. Claude Fontaine arrived in Bellefontaine on June 22nd, 8 days after Daniel's symptoms began. He was a man of 52, thin and sharp-featured, with silver hair and intense dark eyes. He had trained in Paris before immigrating to Louisiana in his 20s, and he carried with him an air of European sophistication that made some people uncomfortable. He spoke with a slight French accent and had a habit of pursing his lips when thinking, as if tasting his own thoughts. Fontaine had established a successful practice in New Orleans, specializing in tropical diseases, and unusual conditions brought by travelers from the Caribbean and South America. He had seen illnesses that most American doctors only read about in journals. Yellow fever, dengue, cholera, parasitic infections that could make a patient waste away before your eyes. His experience was vast, his knowledge deep, and his fees correspondingly high. When Grisham met Fontaine at the dock, he was surprised by the speed of the doctor's arrival. "I sent that letter only 4 days ago," Grisham said, as they shook hands. "I came as soon as I read it," Fontaine replied. "Your description of the symptoms, I needed to see for myself if this is what I think it is." "You've seen this before?" Fontaine didn't answer directly. "Take me to the child." The examination that followed was the most thorough Daniel had received. Fontaine brought with him a large leather case, filled with instruments Grisham had never seen. A device for measuring muscle tension, a set of graduated pins for testing sensitivity to pain, a specialized ophthalmoscope for examining the back of the eye, various calipers and measuring tools. For over 2 hours, Fontaine examined every inch of Daniel's body. He measured the diameter of the pupils, tested reflexes in multiple locations, examined the skin texture, listened to the heart and lungs, pressed on the abdomen, checked the flexibility of joints, and performed dozens of other tests, all while taking detailed notes in a small leather journal. Margaret and Thomas watched from the doorway, not daring to speak. Grisham stood beside Fontaine, observing his methods, occasionally asking questions about a particular test or measurement. The afternoon sun slanted through the window, casting long shadows across the room. Outside, life in Bellefontaine continued. The sound of wagons on the street, voices calling to each other, the distant whistle of a steamboat, but inside Daniel's room, time seemed suspended. Finally, Fontaine straightened up, closed his journal, and turned to face Grisham. His expression was grave. "I need to speak with you privately," he said. They went to Grisham's office, leaving Margaret and Thomas in a state of anxious anticipation. Fontaine closed the door, set down his bag, and poured himself a glass of water from the pitcher on Grisham's desk. He drank slowly, gathering his thoughts. 7 years ago, Fontaine began, I was in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, conducting research on tropical fevers. I was called to examine a child, a boy of 5 or 6, who had developed symptoms very similar to what I just observed in Daniel Carter. Complete muscular rigidity, profound unresponsiveness, a slow heartbeat, a persistent fever that seemed to have no source. The local physicians were baffled. They suspected some kind of poisoning, perhaps from a plant native to the island, or a curse. The people there still believe strongly in such things. "What happened to the child?" Grisham asked. Fontaine was silent for a moment, staring at the water in his glass. He remained in that state for 19 days. Then, suddenly, he began to move again. Small movements at first, just the fingers, then the hands. Within a week, he had regained most of his mobility, but he was changed. Changed how? He no longer recognized his parents. He couldn't speak or wouldn't speak. He would stare at things that weren't there, react with terror to ordinary objects. His personality, everything that had made him who he was, seemed to be gone. He died 3 days later. Grisham felt a chill despite the heat of the room. What was the cause of death? The official record listed it as a wasting disease, but that wasn't accurate. The child simply stopped. Stopped eating, stopped moving, stopped living, as if whatever had brought him back decided to leave again. Do you know what caused it? The initial symptoms? Fontaine shook his head. I never determined a cause. I took tissue samples, studied them as best I could with the equipment available. I found nothing. No bacteria, no parasites, no toxins. The child's organs appeared completely normal during the examination I observed after death. It was as if his body had simply decided to shut down and then partially restart, and then shut down again. But you must have some theory, Grisham pressed. Fontaine set down his glass and looked directly at Grisham. There are conditions of the nervous system we don't understand. The brain is still largely a mystery to us. We know it controls the body, but we don't know how or what can go wrong. I believe, and this is only a theory, that some children, under certain circumstances, can enter a state where the conscious mind separates from the body's autonomic functions. The body continues to live, to breathe, to maintain a heartbeat, but the controlling intelligence is absent. Absent where? That's the question, isn't it? Fontaine said quietly. I don't know. Perhaps trapped somewhere inside the mind itself, unable to reach the muscles, unable to communicate. Perhaps somewhere else entirely. Grisham wanted to dismiss this as superstitious nonsense, but he couldn't. He had seen Daniel Carter. He had examined the boy with every tool and technique he knew, and he had found nothing to explain the condition. If Fontaine, with all his experience and knowledge, was suggesting something this extraordinary, perhaps it needed to be considered. What do you recommend? Grisham asked. Observe. Document. Keep the child as comfortable as possible. Try to get nourishment into him. He will need it if his body is to survive. And prepare the family for the possibility that he may not recover, or if he does, that he may not be the same child they knew. If you're still with us, you're probably wondering the same thing the people of Bellefontaine were asking. How was this child still alive? And more importantly, what was happening inside his mind during those weeks of silence? If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Let's continue to uncover what happens next. Over the following weeks, Bellefontaine became a kind of pilgrimage site for physicians. Word of Daniel Carter's condition spread through medical networks in Louisiana and beyond, drawing doctors who were curious, skeptical, or desperate to make a name for themselves by solving an impossible case. Dr. Samuel Vickery arrived on July 3rd. He was a traveling physician, a large, boisterous man in his 60s who dressed in expensive suits and arrived with a black bag and a bottle of whiskey. Vickery had made his reputation treating wealthy planters throughout the South, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had seen everything and could cure anything. He examined Daniel for perhaps 20 minutes before declaring, "Nervous fever, brought on by miasma from the river. I've seen it a dozen times." Grisham and Fontaine, who had remained in Bellefontaine to monitor the case, exchanged skeptical glances. "What treatment do you recommend?" Grisham asked. "Aggressive purgation to clear the system, hot cupping to draw out the bad humors. And a tonic I've developed myself, secret formula, works wonders." What followed was one of the most unpleasant episodes of the entire ordeal. Vickery administered a purgative so powerful that it should have emptied a grown man's bowels within minutes. Daniel's body did not respond at all. Vickery tried again, doubling the dose. Still nothing. He then applied heated cups to Daniel's back with such force that they left dark bruises on the boy's pale skin. No reaction. Finally, Vickery poured several spoonfuls of his secret tonic, which smelled strongly of alcohol and something acrid, into Daniel's mouth. The liquid pooled at the back of the boy's throat. For a terrifying moment it seemed he might choke. Margaret screamed. Grisham quickly turned Daniel's head to the side, and the liquid drained out onto the pillow. "Get out," Thomas Carter said, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house." Vickery left without another word. He was never seen in Bellefontaine again. Later investigation would reveal that he had no formal medical training, that his reputation was built on charlatan treatments and lucky outcomes. But in the moment, his failure only deepened the mystery of Daniel Carter. Dr. Enoch Landry arrived from Lafayette on July 10th. He was a younger man, in his early 30s, and he had studied diseases of the nervous system at a hospital in Boston. He brought a more scientific approach, measuring the electrical activity of Daniel's muscles with a device called a galvanometer, testing reflexes with tuning forks, examining the boy's responses to various stimuli. Landry spent 3 days in Bellefontaine, conducting experiments and taking detailed notes. His conclusion was sobering. The voluntary nervous system appears to be completely non-functional. while the autonomic nervous system continues to operate. This suggests a profound disconnection between the conscious mind and the motor functions of the body. I've read about similar conditions in medical literature, cases of total paralysis following trauma or infection, but I've never encountered anything this complete or this persistent. "Can it be treated?" Thomas asked. "I don't know," Landry admitted. "The nervous system is still poorly understood. We don't know how to repair damage to it or even how to determine where the damage is located. All I can tell you is that your son's condition is unique in my experience." Dr. Margaret Dufresne arrived from Alexandria on July 15th. She was one of the few female physicians practicing in Louisiana, and her presence caused some consternation among the more conservative residents of Bellefontaine. But her credentials were impeccable. She had trained in Philadelphia and had published several papers on childhood diseases, and the Carters were desperate enough to welcome anyone who might help. Dufresne took a different approach than the male doctors. She spent less time examining Daniel's body and more time talking to Margaret and Thomas, asking detailed questions about Daniel's life before the illness. What was he like? What did he enjoy? What frightened him? Had there been any unusual events in the weeks or months before he fell ill? Had he mentioned any strange dreams or fears? Margaret told her everything she could remember. Daniel had always been quiet, always thoughtful. He had nightmares sometimes, waking in the night crying, though he could never explain what had frightened him. He was afraid of thunderstorms, of the dark cellar where they kept vegetables, of a particular bend in the river where a boy had drowned 2 years ago. He collected stones and arranged them in patterns that seemed meaningful to him, but made no sense to anyone else. Dufresne listened to all of this and took careful notes. On her final evening in Bellefontaine, she shared her theory with Grisham and Fontaine. "I believe this is a disorder of the mind, not the body," she said, "or rather, a disorder of the mind that has manifested in the body. The child has experienced some kind of profound psychological trauma, perhaps something we would never identify as traumatic, something a child's mind might perceive as threatening, even if an adult would not. In response to this trauma, his mind has shut down. It has withdrawn completely, pulling so far inward that it has severed its connection to the physical body." "That's not possible," Landry objected. "The mind can't simply disconnect from the body." "Can't it?" Dufresne challenged. "We see hysterical paralysis. We see cases of blindness or deafness with no physical cause. We know the mind has power over the body. Why couldn't that power, in extreme circumstances, create a complete dissociation?" The debate continued late into the night, but no conclusion was reached. Dufresne returned to Alexandria, leaving behind a detailed report that contributed to the growing file on Daniel Carter, but brought the family no closer to hope. By late July, Daniel had been in his paralyzed state for 6 weeks. The Carter house had become a kind of museum of medical failure, visited by doctors who came, examined, theorized, and left. Each visit raised Margaret's hopes, and then crushed them. Each doctor's departure left her more defeated than before. She had stopped leaving the house entirely. Her sewing work sat untouched in her workroom. She had lost weight, her face becoming gaunt, her hands skeletal. She sat by Daniel's bed, day and night, speaking to him constantly, telling him stories, singing lullabies, describing what was happening outside the window, begging him to come back to her. "Today is Charlotte's birthday," she would say. "She's 12 now. Can you believe it? I know you miss her. She misses you too. She's going to come home soon, and when she does, you need to be awake to see her. Can you do that, Daniel? Can you wake up for your sister?" Thomas had returned to work full-time, but he was a shadow of himself. His supervisor had stopped giving him important tasks after finding too many errors in the ledgers. He moved through his days mechanically, going through the motions of living without really being present. At night, he would sit in the main room of their house, staring at nothing, occasionally drinking from a bottle of whiskey he kept hidden behind the woodpile. The community's initial curiosity had curdled into something darker. Some families had begun avoiding the Carters entirely, crossing the street when they saw Thomas coming, making excuses when Margaret sent notes asking for help with this or that. There was a growing sense that whatever had happened to Daniel might be contagious, or that the family was somehow cursed. A group of men emboldened by drink and fear gathered outside the Carter house one night in early August. They didn't do anything overt, just stood there, talking in loud voices about how unnatural the whole situation was, how some things are best left to God's will, how maybe it would be merciful if the boy just passed on. Thomas confronted them, and a fight broke out. He was beaten badly, suffering broken ribs and a fractured cheekbone. Dr. Grisham treated him, but the damage went deeper than physical injuries. Thomas stopped going to work after that. The family's income ceased. They began to survive on charity from the few neighbors who still sympathized with them. Grisham continued his daily visits, though by now they had become routine. He would check Daniel's vital signs, note any changes, there never were any, and sit with Margaret for a few minutes, offering what comfort he could. He had given up trying new treatments. Everything had been tried. Nothing worked. His journal entries from this period reveal a man grappling with the limits of his profession. August 7, 1849, day 54. Patient remains unchanged. Pulse 3842 BPM. Temperature elevated but stable. No voluntary movement. No response to any stimulus. I have consulted every text I own, written to colleagues across the country, tried every treatment known to medicine. Nothing helps. Nothing changes. I'm forced to confront the possibility that there are conditions the human body can enter that are simply beyond our current capacity to address. The boy lives, but in what sense? Is this life? This existence without awareness, without movement, without any of the qualities that define a human being? I don't know. I am beginning to understand why some of my colleagues have left this profession. There is a kind of helplessness in medicine that is almost unbearable. And then, on the night of August 19th, something changed. Margaret was sitting in her usual place beside Daniel's bed. It was past midnight, and the house was silent except for the occasional creak of settling wood and the distant sound of a steamboat whistle on the river. She had been humming a lullaby, the same one she had sung to Daniel when he was a baby, when she noticed something different about his eyes. For weeks his eyes had been fixed, staring at nothing. But now they were moving, slowly tracking back and forth, as if he were watching something she couldn't see. Margaret stopped humming and leaned closer. "Daniel," she whispered, "can you hear me?" His eyes moved again, focusing on her face for the first time in 66 days. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She reached out and touched his hand. It was still rigid, still unmoving, but there was something different. A tension that hadn't been there before. And then his fingers twitched. It was the smallest movement, barely perceptible, but Margaret saw it. She stood up so quickly her chair fell over backward. "Thomas! Thomas, come here, he's moving!" Thomas stumbled into the room, disoriented by sleep and whiskey. "What? What's happening?" "His hand! I saw his fingers move!" They both stared at Daniel's hand. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, agonizingly slowly, his right hand lifted from the bed. It hovered in the air for perhaps 5 seconds, trembling violently, then fell back down. Thomas ran. He ran through the dark streets of Bellefontaine to Dr. Grisham's practice and pounded on the door until the doctor appeared, disheveled and half asleep. "He's moving," Thomas gasped. "Daniel is moving." They returned to the Carter house together, arriving to find Margaret kneeling beside the bed, tears streaming down her face. Daniel's head was turning slowly from side to side, and both his hands were clenching and unclenching rhythmically. Grisham examined the boy quickly, his trained hands checking pulse, temperature, reflexes. The rigidity was breaking down, the muscles beginning to respond again. Daniel's eyes were open and aware now, tracking movement around the room. His mouth opened and closed, as if he were trying to speak, but no sound emerged. "This is remarkable," Grisham said, his voice shaking with excitement. "After all this time, the paralysis is resolving. I don't understand how or why, but he's coming back." Over the next 3 days, Daniel regained the ability to move, first his hands and feet, then his arms and legs, then his torso. By August 22nd, he could sit up with assistance. By August 23rd, he could stand, though he was weak and unsteady. By August 24th, he could walk a few steps with support. But even as his body recovered, it became clear that something was profoundly wrong. The Daniel Carter, who emerged from his paralysis, was not the same boy who had entered it. The change was immediately apparent to everyone who saw him. He did not speak, not a word, not a sound. When his mother asked him questions, he stared at her as if he didn't understand the language. When his father tried to embrace him, he pulled away with a look of confusion and fear, as if Thomas were a stranger. His behavior was strange in ways that were difficult to describe, but impossible to ignore. He would sit motionless for hours, staring at a spot on the wall or at his own hands. He recoiled from touch, from loud sounds, from sudden movements. At night, he would not sleep in his bed, instead curling up in corners under furniture, in the darkest parts of the house he could find. "Doctor?" Grisham was baffled. Physically, Daniel seemed to be recovering. His muscle tone was returning. His reflexes were normal. His fever had finally broken. But mentally, emotionally, the child was absent. Dr. Fontaine, who had remained in Bellefontaine for the entire ordeal, examined Daniel extensively. He tried to communicate with the boy through gestures, through pictures, through any means he could think of. Nothing worked. Daniel seemed to be locked inside himself, unable or unwilling to connect with the world around him. On August 26th, Margaret was sitting with Daniel in his room when he spoke for the first time. His voice was hoarse, barely audible, and the words were simple, but they sent a chill through everyone who heard them. They were always there. Margaret leaned forward, desperate to understand. "Who was always there, Daniel? What do you mean?" Daniel's eyes focused on her, and for just a moment she saw recognition, saw her son looking back at her. Then it was gone, replaced by that distant, empty stare. "Watching," he whispered, "always watching." He did not speak again for 3 days. Dr. Herbert Lane arrived from New Orleans on August 29th. He was a specialist in disorders of the mind, one of the few physicians in America who had studied with practitioners in Europe who were developing new theories about mental illness and trauma. He spent a week with Daniel, observing his behavior, attempting various therapeutic interventions, taking detailed notes. Lane's conclusion was disturbing. "The child has experienced profound psychological trauma, though I cannot determine the source. It's as if he has witnessed or experienced something so terrible that his mind cannot process it. He has withdrawn into himself as a defense mechanism. Whether he will ever emerge fully is impossible to predict." "But what could have caused such trauma?" Margaret asked. "He was just a little boy. He had nightmares sometimes, but nothing unusual. Nothing that would explain this." Lane shook his head. "The mind, especially a child's mind, can be damaged by things we would never suspect. Sometimes the trauma occurs during the illness itself. If he was aware during those weeks of paralysis, if he was conscious but unable to move, unable to communicate, that experience alone could have been devastating." "You're saying he was trapped inside his own body for 2 months, aware the whole time?" Thomas asked, his face pale. "I'm saying it's possible. We don't know. We may never know." 12. The decline. September brought no improvement. Daniel continued to deteriorate, though in different ways than before. He was moving now, but he seemed to be wasting away from the inside. Despite eating small amounts of food, Margaret had to spoon-feed him like an infant. He continued to lose weight. His skin took on a grayish pallor, his eyes sank deeper into his skull, his hair began to fall out in clumps. He spoke occasionally, always the same phrases. They were watching. They never left. They were waiting. When pressed to explain who they were, he would become agitated, sometimes violent. flailing his arms and making sounds that might have been screams if they had more force behind them. The house had become a prison. Margaret refused to leave Daniel's side. Thomas had stopped even pretending to function. They had no income, no savings, and were surviving on charity that was becoming increasingly scarce as the community's patience wore thin. On September 5th, Dr. Fontaine made an announcement. He was leaving Bellefontaine. He had patients in New Orleans who needed him, and there was nothing more he could do for Daniel Carter. Before he left, he met privately with Grisham. "I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone else," Fontaine said. "That child in Port-au-Prince, the one I mentioned when I first arrived, there was something I didn't tell you about how he died." "Go on," Grisham said. In the days before his death, he spoke. Not much, just fragments, but always the same theme. He talked about being watched, about things that waited for him. His exact words, I wrote them down at the time, were, "They never stop watching, even when you close your eyes." 3 days later, he was dead. And you think Daniel is saying the same things? Not just the same things. The exact same things in some cases. The same phrases, the same tone. It's as if they both saw the same. Whatever it was. What do you think they saw? Fontaine was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. "I think they went somewhere. During that time of paralysis, I think their consciousness went somewhere, and they saw something there. Something terrible. And when they came back, they couldn't forget it. They couldn't escape it. That's not a medical diagnosis. No, it's not. But I've been practicing medicine for 30 years, and I've learned that there are things in this world that don't fit into our medical texts. Things we don't have names for. Things we may never understand." Fontaine left the next morning. Grisham never saw him again. By early September, Daniel had stopped eating entirely. Margaret tried everything. Soups, broths, soft breads, anything she thought he might be able to swallow. He would turn his head away, clamp his mouth shut, or simply let the food dribble out. His weight had dropped so low that he looked skeletal, his bones visible through translucent skin. Dr. Grisham knew the end was approaching. He had seen enough dying patients to recognize the signs. He tried to prepare Margaret and Thomas, but how do you prepare parents to lose a child, especially under such circumstances? On September 12th, Daniel opened his eyes and seemed to see Margaret clearly for the first time in weeks. She was sitting beside him, as always, and when he looked at her, something in his expression changed. For just a moment, he was her son again. "Mama," he whispered. Margaret burst into tears, grabbing his hand. "I'm here, baby, I'm here." "I was so far away," Daniel said, his voice weak but clear. "I couldn't find my way back." "You're here now," Margaret said, sobbing. "You're home now." Daniel's eyes closed. "They're still watching," he murmured. "They never stop." Those were the last coherent words he ever spoke. For the next 3 days, he drifted in and out of consciousness, his breathing becoming shallower, his pulse weakening. Margaret held his hand constantly, talking to him, singing to him, refusing to let go. Daniel Carter died on the morning of September 15th, 1849, exactly 3 months after his symptoms had begun. He simply stopped breathing peacefully, while his mother held him. There was no struggle, no final crisis. One moment he was alive, barely, and the next he was gone. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply sat there holding her son's hand, staring at his still face, as if refusing to acknowledge what had happened. Thomas had to physically pull her away so that Dr. Grisham could confirm the death. 14. The autopsy, Doctor. Grisham stood in his examination room, looking down at Daniel Carter's body, and made a decision that he knew would be controversial. He needed to understand what had killed this child. He needed answers, if not for the Carters, then for himself, for medicine, for the possibility that another child might someday present with similar symptoms. He went to the Carter house and made his request. Margaret refused immediately, horrified at the idea of her son's body being cut open. Thomas was equally opposed. But Grisham persisted, arguing that Daniel's death should mean something, should contribute to medical knowledge, should help prevent other families from suffering as they had suffered. It took hours of discussion, but finally, with great reluctance, Thomas and Margaret agreed with strict conditions. The autopsy would be private, the body would be treated with respect, and the results would not be made public without their permission. The autopsy was performed on September 16th, with Dr. Landry and Dr. Dufresne present as witnesses. Grisham had invited them to stay in Bellefontaine specifically for this purpose, knowing that such an unusual case deserved the scrutiny of multiple trained observers. What they found, or rather, what they didn't find, became one of the most perplexing aspects of the entire case. Daniel's internal organs were completely normal. His heart showed no signs of disease or malformation. His lungs were clear. His liver, kidneys, and spleen were all healthy and properly developed. His stomach and intestines showed signs of recent malnutrition, but no disease. His brain, when carefully examined, showed no evidence of tumors, lesions, bleeding, or structural abnormalities of any kind. "This is impossible," Landry said, staring at the exposed organs. "This child should not have been sick. There's nothing wrong with him." But there was one anomaly, and it was Dr. Dufresne who noticed it first. The muscles, particularly in the limbs, showed a pattern of atrophy that made no medical sense. Some muscle groups had wasted away almost completely, as if they hadn't been used for years. But adjacent muscles, served by the same nerves and blood vessels, appeared normal. The pattern of deterioration seemed random, without any logical distribution. Landry took tissue samples from multiple locations, carefully preserving them in jars of alcohol. He would later send these samples to colleagues in New York and Boston for microscopic examination. The results, when they finally arrived months later, only deepened the mystery. The tissue was described variously as unusual in cellular structure, showing signs of premature aging, and defying standard histological classification. Grisham completed the autopsy and wrote his report with a heavy heart. His conclusion was stark and unavoidable. Complete examination of the deceased has failed to reveal any anatomical cause of death. All major organs appear normal and healthy. Minor muscle atrophy is noted but does not account for the severity of symptoms observed during life. Cause of death remains unknown. He presented his findings to Landry and Dufresne, expecting debate or alternative theories. Instead, they both agreed with his assessment. They had no explanation. They could not, in good conscience, attribute Daniel's death to any known disease. The question of the death certificate remained. In Louisiana in 1849, a death could not be registered without a stated cause. Grisham wrote to the other physicians who had examined Daniel, Fontaine, Vickery, Lane, requesting that they provide their professional opinion on the cause of death for the official record. Fontaine did not respond. Vickery could not be located. Lane sent a brief letter stating that he believed the death was caused by nervous system failure secondary to psychological trauma, but he admitted this was purely theoretical and that he could not sign a death certificate to that effect. In the end, none of the 7 physicians who had examined Daniel Carter were willing to sign his death certificate. It was filed with the parish clerk, with the cause of death listed simply as undetermined. Such an admission was almost unheard of in medical practice, a public acknowledgement that 7 trained doctors, with all their knowledge and experience, had been defeated by the illness of a single 6-year-old child. The Carters buried Daniel in the small cemetery on the outskirts of Bellefontaine on September 18, 1849. The funeral was sparsely attended. Reverend Holloway presided, but his sermon was brief and uncomfortable, full of platitudes about God's will and the mysteries of faith. Most of the town stayed away. Margaret stood by the grave like a statue, not crying, not speaking, barely seeming to breathe. Thomas held her arm to keep her upright. Dr. Grisham attended, as did Dr. Landry and Dr. Dufresne, who had remained to see the case through to its conclusion. A few neighbors came, mostly out of obligation. Charlotte and Anne, brought back from their aunt's house for the funeral, stood together, holding hands, looking lost and frightened. The gravestone was simple, provided by a local stonecutter who took pity on the family's poverty. It bore only Daniel's name and the dates of his birth and death. Daniel Carter, 1843-1849. No epitaph, no Bible verse, no explanation. Just a name and dates marking the brief existence of a boy whose death would haunt everyone who had known him. In the weeks and months that followed, the Carter family disintegrated. Margaret never recovered. She stopped speaking almost entirely, stopped caring for herself, stopped engaging with the world. She would spend entire days sitting in Daniel's empty room, staring at nothing. Thomas tried to care for her, but he was broken himself, unable to work, unable to function. They lost their house when they couldn't pay rent. They moved in with Margaret's sister, living in a single room, dependent on charity. Charlotte and Anne grew up fast, taking on adult responsibilities to keep the family afloat. They worked in the homes of wealthier families, cleaning, cooking, caring for children. As soon as they were old enough, they left Louisiana entirely. Charlotte moved to Mobile, Alabama, and married a shopkeeper. Anne went north to St. Louis. Neither ever returned to Bellefontaine, and neither ever spoke of their brother, even to their own children years later. Thomas died in 1852, 3 years after Daniel. The cause was listed as consumption, but those who knew him said he died of a broken heart and a broken spirit. Margaret outlived him by 7 years, existing in a state of perpetual grief, never fully present, never fully herself. She died in 1859, in the same room where Daniel had spent his final months, whispering his name with her last breath. Dr. Grisham continued to practice in Bellefontaine for another 14 years, but the Daniel Carter case changed him. His journals became filled with philosophical reflections on the limits of medical knowledge, on the mysteries that lie beyond human understanding, on the arrogance of believing we can explain everything through science and reason. He wrote less about his cases and more about his doubts. He began to question treatments he had once applied with confidence. He became more cautious, more humble, more willing to admit when he didn't know something. Some in Bellefontaine thought he had lost his nerve. Others thought he had gained wisdom. In 1860, he wrote an entry that captures his state of mind in the years after Daniel's death. I have practiced medicine for 26 years. I have treated hundreds of patients, witnessed countless illnesses, observed the human body in every state of health and disease. I have read extensively, consulted with colleagues, attended lectures and demonstrations. I have devoted my life to understanding how the body works and what can be done when it fails. And yet, the case that haunts me most is the one I could not explain, could not treat, could not even properly diagnose. Daniel Carter's illness and death revealed to me the profound limitations of our medical knowledge. We pretend to understand so much, but in truth we understand so little. The human body and mind remain mysteries, capable of conditions and behaviors that defy all our theories and treatments. Perhaps that is how it should be. Perhaps there are aspects of human existence that are meant to remain mysterious, that will forever elude our attempts at explanation. Or perhaps we simply haven't learned enough yet. Perhaps in 100 years, doctors will look back at our primitive understanding and marvel at our ignorance. I don't know which possibility troubles me more. The case of Daniel Carter faded from public consciousness quickly. Bellefontaine moved on to other tragedies, other scandals, other stories. The fever season of 1850 brought yellow fever to the region, killing dozens. The economic upheaval of the 1850s brought financial hardship. The Civil War came and transformed everything, leaving the antebellum world unrecognizable. Dr. Grisham died in 1863 during the Union occupation of Louisiana. His practice was shut down, his building requisitioned for military use. His medical journals, dozens of leather-bound volumes documenting 30 years of practice, were packed away by a distant cousin who inherited his few belongings. They spent decades in an attic in Baton Rouge, forgotten and gathering dust. It wasn't until 1891 that Grisham's journals were donated to the Louisiana State Medical Society by the cousin's daughter, who was cleaning out her family home. They were catalogued and placed in storage, one collection among many, considered mildly interesting from a historical perspective, but not particularly valuable. There they sat for another 80 years. In the 1970s, a medical historian named Dr. Robert Chen was researching 19th-century medical practices in the American South. He was particularly interested in how physicians of that era dealt with diseases they didn't understand. He spent weeks in the Medical Society's archives, reading through old journals and case reports, when he came across Dr. Nathaniel Grisham's volumes. The entries about Daniel Carter caught his attention immediately. The detail, the precision, the obvious bewilderment of a trained physician confronting something beyond his experience. It was extraordinary. Chen spent months tracking down every reference he could find to the case. He discovered letters from Dr. Fontaine in the archives of Charity Hospital in New Orleans. He found a brief mention in a medical journal from 1851, referring to the Louisiana paralysis case. He located parish records that confirmed Daniel's death and the unusual notation of undetermined as cause of death. Chen published his findings in 1977 in a paper titled An Unexplained Pediatric Case from Antebellum, Louisiana, Medical Mystery or Documentation Failure. The paper appeared in a relatively obscure journal of medical history and attracted little attention at the time. Most readers assumed the case was simply an example of how little 19th-century medicine understood about neurological disorders. But a few researchers became intrigued. In 1984, a neurologist in Boston read Chen's paper and wrote a response suggesting that Daniel might have suffered from acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, a rare autoimmune condition that can cause sudden paralysis and altered consciousness. Others proposed viral encephalitis, Guillain-Barré syndrome, or even a psychosomatic disorder. None of these theories fully explained all of Daniel's symptoms, particularly the extended period of paralysis while maintaining consciousness, the extremely slow heartbeat, the ability to survive weeks with minimal nutrition, and the profound personality changes that occurred after mobility returned. In 1995, a psychiatrist named Dr. Alicia Torres proposed a radical theory. She suggested that Daniel might have been experiencing what she called extreme dissociative catatonia, a condition in which severe psychological trauma causes the mind to completely disconnect from the body. She pointed to modern cases of children who had suffered extreme trauma and entered states of profound withdrawal. However, even these modern cases didn't match the duration or complete physiological changes documented in Daniel's case. 17. The modern investigation. In 2003, Dr. Laura Hensley, a semi-retired physician with a passion for historical medical mysteries, came across Dr. Chen's 1977 paper while researching something else entirely. She became immediately obsessed with the case. She read everything that had been written about it, then began her own investigation. Hensley traveled to Louisiana multiple times over the next 8 years. She visited the site where Bellefontaine had once stood. The town itself had been gradually absorbed into a larger municipality and had lost its distinct identity by the early 20th century. She searched through parish records, church archives, cemetery records, anything that might provide additional information about the Carter family or the physicians who had treated Daniel. She tracked down descendants of Dr. Grisham, Dr. Fontaine, and Dr. Landry. She found a great-great-granddaughter of Charlotte Carter living in Florida who had never heard of her ancestor's tragic brother, but agreed to be interviewed. She located the cemetery where Daniel was buried and found his gravestone, weathered and overgrown but still legible. Most remarkably, in a storage facility in Lafayette that was about to be demolished, Hensley discovered a box of papers that had belonged to Dr. Landry. Among them were the tissue samples he had taken during Daniel's autopsy, still preserved in their original glass jars, the alcohol long since evaporated, but the tissue itself remaining. With permission from the Carter descendants, Hensley arranged for modern analysis of these samples. Using 21st century technology, DNA sequencing, electron microscopy, immunohistochemistry, researchers at Louisiana State University examined the 160-year-old tissue samples. The results were published in 2011 and they were inconclusive. The tissue showed signs of degradation from age and improper storage, making definitive analysis impossible. However, researchers noted several anomalies. The muscle tissue showed unusual patterns of cellular breakdown that didn't match any known disease process. There were signs of what might have been an immune response, but it was unlike any typical pattern of infection or autoimmune disease. Most intriguingly, the cellular structure of some samples showed what one researcher described as premature senescence. The cells appeared much older than they should have been, as if they had aged years in a matter of weeks. This phenomenon had been observed in certain genetic disorders and in extreme cases of physical stress, but never to this degree and never in a child so young. Dr. Hensley compiled all her research into a book published in 2011, The Silent Child, An Unsolved Medical Mystery. The book presented the most complete account of Daniel Carter's case ever assembled, including excerpts from Grisham's journals, letters from the other physicians, interviews with descendants, and analysis from modern medical experts. Her conclusion was carefully worded. The case of Daniel Carter represents either an extremely rare condition that has not been observed again in medical history, or a combination of factors, environmental, genetic, psychological, infectious, that created a perfect storm of symptoms we cannot fully explain, even with modern knowledge. What is certain is that this child suffered in ways we can barely imagine, and that his case exposed the profound limitations of both 19th century and 21st century medicine. There are still mysteries in human biology that we have not solved. Conditions that do not fit neatly into our diagnostic categories, illnesses that challenge everything we think we know about how the body and mind work. 18. The unanswered questions. Even now, more than 170 years after Daniel Carter's death, questions remain. What caused his initial paralysis? Why did it last so long? How did his body survive for weeks with minimal nutrition? What did he experience during those months of immobility? What caused the personality changes when mobility returned? And ultimately, what killed him? Modern physicians who have reviewed the case offer various theories, but none are entirely satisfactory. Some neurologists suggest a rare form of encephalitis that affected specific brain regions, controlling voluntary movement while leaving autonomic functions intact. But this doesn't explain the extended duration of symptoms or the survival without proper nutrition. Some psychiatrists point to dissociative disorders and the powerful effect of trauma on the developing brain. But documented cases of childhood dissociation don't show the degree of physical paralysis or physiological changes that Daniel experienced. Some researchers have suggested environmental toxins, perhaps something in the Mississippi River water or a plant he had contact with, or even deliberate poisoning. But the autopsy found no evidence of toxins, and no other cases similar to Daniel's were reported in Bellefontaine during that period. A few have even proposed that Daniel might have suffered from multiple conditions simultaneously, perhaps a neurological infection that triggered a severe psychological response, combined with an underlying genetic vulnerability. But this is speculation built on speculation, with no way to prove or disprove it. The most honest answer is simply, we don't know. Despite all our medical advances, despite our sophisticated understanding of neurology, psychology, and physiology, the case of Daniel Carter remains unexplained. If Daniel Carter's case has a legacy, it's perhaps this. It serves as a reminder of the limits of human knowledge and the persistence of mystery, even in our age of science and technology. The 7 physicians who examined Daniel were not incompetent. They were trained professionals doing their best with the knowledge and tools available to them. Dr. Grisham was meticulous in his documentation. Dr. Fontaine had extensive experience with rare diseases. Dr. Landry was trained in the latest neurological science of his era, and yet they all failed. Not because they were bad doctors, but because they encountered something beyond the boundaries of medical knowledge. And even today, with all our advanced technology, MRI machines, genetic sequencing, neuroimaging, sophisticated blood tests, we cannot fully explain what happened to Daniel. We can offer theories, we can make educated guesses, but we cannot say with certainty what illness took him. This should humble us. It should remind us that for all our progress, for all our scientific advancement, there are still mysteries in this world. There are still conditions that baffle even the best physicians. There are still cases where we must admit, as Dr. Grisham did, that we simply don't know. The grave of Daniel Carter still exists in what is now called Riverside Memorial Cemetery, though few people visit it. The original simple headstone has been replaced over the years, but the current marker still bears the same basic information. Daniel Carter, 1843-1849. If you go there on a quiet afternoon, you'll find it's an ordinary grave in an ordinary cemetery. There's nothing to indicate the medical mystery it represents, nothing to suggest the suffering that occurred, nothing to memorialize the 7 physicians who tried and failed to save this boy's life. But perhaps that's appropriate, because Daniel Carter was just a child. Not a medical curiosity, not a case study, but a 6-year-old boy who liked to collect stones and watch his mother sew. A boy who had nightmares sometimes, who was afraid of thunderstorms, who died far too young after suffering in ways we cannot fully comprehend. His story survives not because it provides answers, but because it asks questions we still cannot fully answer. What are the limits of the human body? What can the mind experience in states of profound alteration? What mysteries remain hidden in our biology, waiting to reveal themselves under the right or wrong circumstances? Dr. Grisham's final journal entry about Daniel Carter, written in December 1849, 3 months after the boy's death, perhaps says it best. I have thought much about young Daniel in the months since his passing. I have reviewed my notes countless times, searching for some detail I might have missed, some clue that would make sense of what happened. I have found nothing. I am forced to accept that I witnessed something I cannot explain, something that challenged every principle of medicine I was taught and every belief I held about the nature of illness and the capabilities of the human body. If there is a lesson in this tragedy, it is perhaps the lesson of humility. We physicians carry ourselves with such confidence as if we understand the mechanisms of life and death. But the truth is, we know so little. We see the surface of things, we observe symptoms and prescribe treatments, but the deep mysteries, what makes us conscious, what connects mind to body, what spark of life animates us and then departs, these remain beyond our grasp. Daniel Carter suffered and died, and I could not help him. That failure will follow me all my days. But perhaps his suffering was not entirely meaningless. Perhaps his case will be studied by physicians of future generations who will have tools and knowledge we cannot imagine, and perhaps they will understand what I could not. Or perhaps his case will remain forever mysterious, a reminder that there are aspects of human existence that transcend understanding, that belong to a realm beyond medicine and science. I do not know which I believe. I know only that I tried my best, and my best was not enough. And I suspect that no matter how much medicine advances, there will always be cases like Daniel's, mysteries that remind us of our limitations, puzzles that resist our attempts at solution. Perhaps that is how it should be. Perhaps complete understanding would rob life of its essential mystery, its unknowable depth. Or perhaps I am just an old doctor trying to find meaning in a child's meaningless death. God rest his soul. And may his memory remind those who come after me to approach medicine with humility, with wonder, and with the understanding that we will never know all there is to know. This mystery shows us that even in our modern age, with all our advances in medicine and science, there remain cases that defy explanation, conditions that challenge everything we think we know about the human body. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Was Daniel Carter suffering from an unknown disease, a psychological condition, or something else entirely? Leave your comment below with your theory. If you enjoyed this tale, and want more horror stories like this? Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. The past holds many secrets, and we're here to uncover them together. See you in the next video.